The sun was dipping low over the Pacific, casting a golden sheen across the rugged coastline of Monterey, California, as Michael Bennett's car wound its way along the twisting roads toward his sprawling seaside estate. The air was thick with the briny scent of the ocean, mingling with the faint perfume of eucalyptus trees that lined the property's long gated driveway. Michael, a tech mogul whose name was synonymous with Silicon Valley success, had just returned from a grueling 2-month stint in Seattle, where he'd been hammering out a merger that would cement his company's dominance in the AI industry. His driver, a stoic man named Harold, who'd been with him for years, slowed the sleek black sedan as they approached the towering iron gates. Michael uncharacteristically waved him off. "I'll walk from here, Harold," he said, his voice low but firm, as though he were testing the weight of his own decision. Harold raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, pulling the car to a stop and watching as Michael stepped out of his polished loafers, crunching against the gravel. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael wanted to approach his own home without fanfare, without the usual entourage of assistants and security personnel trailing behind him like shadows. He wanted to feel the ground beneath his feet, to breathe in the salt air, to reclaim a piece of the life he'd built, but rarely lived. The gates parted with a soft hum, and Michael began the long walk up the driveway, the estate looming ahead like a monument to his ambition. The house was a marvel of modern architecture, glass walls that reflected the ocean's restless waves, sharp angles softened by climbing ivy, and a sprawling deck that seemed to hover above the cliffs. It was the kind of place that graced the covers of design magazines, a testament to wealth and taste. But to Michael, it had always felt more like a stage than a home. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spent more than a weekend here, the last time he'd walked these grounds without a phone pressed to his ear or a schedule dictating his every move. Tonight, though, was different. There were no meetings on the horizon, no urgent emails pinging his phone, no investors clamoring for his attention. He'd cleared his calendar for a week, an unheard-of act for a man whose life was measured in quarterly reports and stock prices. He wanted to see his children Lily and Ethan, not through the blurry lens of a video call but in person, to hear their laughter, to know them again. The thought made his chest tighten, a pang of something he couldn't quite name, guilt, perhaps, or longing. As he neared the house, Michael noticed the quiet. It wasn't just the absence of city noise, no honking horns, no distant sirens, but a deeper stillness that seemed to blanket the estate. The usual hum of activity was gone. No staff bustling through the halls, no security team murmuring into earpieces, no clatter of dishes from the kitchen where his personal chef usually prepared elaborate meals he rarely had time to eat. The silence was almost unnerving, like stepping into a painting where the world had paused. He pushed open the heavy oak door, its hinges whispering softly, and stepped into the foyer. The space was vast, with a polished marble floor that gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting. A chandelier of hand-blown glass hung overhead, its delicate tendrils catching the last rays of sunset. Michael set his briefcase down, the thud echoing faintly, and took a moment to absorb the emptiness. He'd expected chaos, the kind of joyful disorder that came with 2 young children, but instead, the house felt like it was holding its breath. He wandered deeper into the house, his footsteps muffled by a thick Persian rug that stretched across the living room. The ocean was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, its surface a restless expanse of silver and blue. Michael paused, his eyes catching on small, unexpected details that seemed to belong to someone else's life. On the coffee table, a half-finished watercolor painting lay abandoned, its edges curling slightly. The paper was covered in bold strokes of turquoise and green, a child's attempt at capturing the sea. Lily's work, no doubt, she'd always been fascinated by the ocean, ever since she was old enough to toddle down to the shore with her little bucket and spade. Michael smiled faintly, picturing her small hands gripping the brush, her tongue poking out in concentration. Nearby, under the edge of a sleek leather sectional, a soccer ball sat wedged against the wall, scuffed and slightly deflated. Ethan's, he thought, remembering how his son would kick it around the deck until someone, usually Clara the nanny, gently redirected him to avoid breaking something priceless. The house wasn't empty, though. A faint sound drifted from the direction of the family room, a soft melody that seemed to weave itself into the air. Michael followed it, his curiosity piqued. The music was classical. Something gentle and lilting, Debussy maybe, or Satie, played at a volume that felt intimate, not overpowering. As he rounded the corner, he heard another sound, one that made his heart skip, a voice warm and steady reading aloud. It was Clara, the nanny, who'd been with the family since Lily was born. Her voice had a quality that Michael had always found remarkable, a soothing cadence that could calm even the wildest tantrum. She was reading now, her words painting a vivid picture. The explorer stood at the bow of his ship, the wind whipping his cloak as he scanned the horizon for the lost island of Eldora, where legends said the sea itself whispered secrets to those brave enough to listen. Michael slowed his steps, not wanting to interrupt, and leaned against the wall, just outside the family room, letting the words wash over him. He peeked around the doorway, careful not to draw attention. The scene before him was like something from a storybook itself. Clara sat cross-legged on a plush rug, a thick illustrated book open on her lap. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her glasses perched precariously on the tip of her nose as she read with quiet intensity. Lily and Ethan were sprawled out in front of her, nestled into a nest of pillows and blankets. Lily, 7 years old, and all sharp elbows and bright eyes, clutched a stuffed octopus, its tentacles dangling over her arm as she listened, utterly engrossed. Ethan, 5, and perpetually in motion, was unusually still, his chin resting on his hands as he stared at the book's colorful pages. On the low table beside them sat a tray with 3 mugs, steam curling upward, the faint scent of hot cocoa mingling with the salty air that seeped through an open window. The room was lit by a single floor lamp, its warm glow casting soft shadows that danced across the walls. Michael stayed in the shadows, watching as Clara turned a page, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the story. The explorer's ship creaked under the weight of the storm, but he held fast to the wheel, knowing the island was close. Lily's eyes widened, and she tugged at the sleeve of Clara's sweater, whispering something Michael couldn't hear. Clara smiled, nodding, and continued her words, weaving a spell that held the children captive. Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. This was what he'd been missing. Not the grand gestures, the expensive toys, or the lavish vacations he'd planned to make up for his absence, but this, the quiet magic of a story, the way it lit up his children's faces, the way it made the world feel safe and full of wonder. He thought of all the nights he'd spent in boardrooms or hotel rooms, chasing deals that seemed so vital at the time, while moments like this unfolded without him. He shifted slightly, and a floorboard creaked under his weight. Clara paused mid-sentence, her eyes flicking toward the doorway. Lily and Ethan turned their faces, lighting up as they saw him. Daddy Lily squealed, scrambling to her feet and launching herself at him. Ethan was right behind her, his small body colliding with Michael's legs in a clumsy hug. Michael dropped to one knee, wrapping his arms around them both, the warmth of their embrace chasing away the chill he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Hey, you two," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What's this about an explorer and a lost island?" Clara closed the book, her smile soft, but knowing, as though she understood exactly what this moment meant to him. The music played on a quiet backdrop to the sudden burst of life in the room, and for the first time in years, Michael felt the weight of his world shift just a little toward something that felt like home. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of the Monterey estate, painting the hardwood floors with stripes of gold and warming the air with a faint, briny tang from the Pacific. Michael Bennett woke to the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below, a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign. He lay in his oversized bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets cool against his skin, and stared at the ceiling where a fan spun lazily, stirring the quiet. Last night's reunion with Lily and Ethan had left him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years, but as he swung his legs over the side of the bed and rubbed the sleep from his eyes, a familiar unease settled in his chest. He was home, yes, but the house still felt like someone else's, a museum of his success filled with artifacts of a life he barely knew. His children's laughter from the night before echoed in his mind, but so did the realization that he didn't know them, not really. How many bedtimes had he missed? How many stories had Clara told in his place? The thought gnawed at him as he pulled on a pair of jeans and a soft sweater, opting for comfort over the tailored suits that defined his usual existence. Downstairs, the house was beginning to stir. The scent of fresh coffee wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the buttery aroma of pancakes sizzling on a griddle. Michael followed the sounds, his bare feet padding softly against the cool tiles of the hallway. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design stainless steel appliances, a marble island that gleamed under pendant lights, and a view of the ocean that made every meal feel like a postcard. Clara was at the stove, her dark hair tied back with a scarf, her movements precise but unhurried as she flipped a pancake with a practiced flick of her wrist. Lily sat at the island, her legs swinging as she sketched on a pad of paper, her tongue poking out in concentration. Ethan was sprawled on the floor nearby, surrounded by a scattering of colored pencils and a notebook, where he was scribbling what looked like a map, complete with jagged lines that might have been mountains or waves. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," Clara said, without turning her voice warm but neutral, as though she sensed the delicate balance of his presence. "Coffee's on the counter. Pancakes will be ready in a minute." Michael poured himself a mug, the dark roast steaming, as he leaned against the counter watching his children. Lily's sketch was taking shape, a sailboat bobbing on a sea of swirling blues with a tiny figure at the helm that looked suspiciously like her stuffed octopus. Ethan's map was less coherent, a chaotic blend of squiggles and arrows, but his focus was intense, his small fingers gripping the pencil as if it were a lifeline. Michael wanted to say something to bridge the gap between them, but the words felt stuck like pebbles in his throat. "That's a great boat, Lily," he ventured, his voice sounding louder than he intended in the quiet kitchen. Lily glanced up, her hazel eyes bright but guarded. "Thanks, Daddy," she said, then returned to her drawing, her pencil moving faster now, as if to fill the silence. Ethan didn't look up at all, his attention fixed on his map. Michael felt a pang of rejection, subtle but sharp, and took a sip of coffee to mask it. Clara slid a plate of pancakes onto the island, topped with sliced strawberries and a dusting of powdered sugar. "Breakfast is served," she announced, her tone light, but carrying an undercurrent of authority that got the kids moving. Lily set her sketchpad aside and Ethan scrambled up from the floor, his notebook forgotten as he climbed onto a stool. Michael joined them, pulling up a seat and trying to settle into the moment. The pancakes were perfect, fluffy golden, with a hint of vanilla, but as he cut into his, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was a guest at his own table. He tried to make conversation, asking Lily about her boat drawing. "Is that for school?" he asked, hoping to draw her out. She shook her head, her mouth full of pancake. No, it's just for fun. I want to be a marine biologist when I grow up, so I'm practicing. Michael nodded, impressed, but unsure how to respond. That's great, Lily. The ocean's a big place to explore. She gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes, and he wondered what he'd missed in the years it had taken her to form that dream. Ethan was quieter, picking at his strawberries with his fingers, leaving red smudges on the marble. Michael tried again. "What's your map about, buddy?" he asked, leaning forward. Ethan shrugged his shoulders, hunching slightly. "It's for a story," he mumbled, barely audible. "About a pirate who finds a secret cave." Michael seized on the opening, his voice brightening. "A pirate, huh? Does he have a ship?" Ethan nodded but didn't elaborate, his eyes fixed on his plate. Clara stepped in, her voice gentle but firm. "Ethan's been working on that story all week. He's got a whole adventure planned out, don't you, Ethan?" The boy glanced at her, a flicker of pride crossing his face, but he didn't look at Michael. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clink of forks and the distant crash of waves. After breakfast, Michael lingered in the kitchen as Clara cleared the plates, the kids scampering off to the family room. He watched them go, feeling the weight of their distance. He remembered birthdays he'd missed: Lily's 6th, when he'd been stuck in Tokyo sending a dollhouse that arrived a week late. Ethan's 4th, when a conference call had kept him in New York, his apology delivered via a rushed video message. He'd always told himself he was building a future for them, that the long hours and endless trips were for their benefit. But now, standing in this pristine kitchen, he wasn't so sure. Clara, wiping down the counters, seemed to sense his mood. "They're glad you're here, you know," she said, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "They just need time to get used to it. You've been gone a while." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "I know. I don't know how to start." Clara paused, her hands still on the cloth, and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts compassion and challenge. "Start small," she said. "Ask them about their day, their stories, their drawings. They don't need big gestures. They just need you." Her words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through him. He wanted to believe her, but the doubt lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. He followed the kids to the family room, determined to try. The room was bright with sunlight streaming through the windows and the ocean sparkling beyond. Lily was back at her sketchpad, adding details to her sailboat, while Ethan sat at a small table, his notebook open and a bottle of ink beside it. Michael sat down nearby, trying to look casual. "Can I see your story, Ethan?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Ethan hesitated, then slid the notebook toward him. The pages were filled with childish scrawl, a mix of words and drawings, ships, caves, a stick-figure pirate with a lopsided hat. Michael smiled, genuinely impressed. "This is awesome, Ethan. You've got a real knack for this." Ethan's face lit up for a moment, but then he reached for the ink bottle, his small hands fumbling. Before Michael could react, the bottle tipped, spilling a pool of black ink across the table and onto the rug. Ethan froze, his eyes wide with panic. "I'm sorry," he blurted, his voice trembling. Michael's first instinct was to reassure him, but years of high-stakes decisions and quick judgments took over. "Ethan, you've got to be more careful," he said, his tone sharper than he meant. "That's going to stain." The words hung in the air, and Ethan's face crumpled, his eyes filling with tears. He pushed the notebook away and ran from the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Lily looked up, her pencil still, her expression unreadable. Clara, who had appeared in the doorway, gave Michael a look that wasn't accusatory, but carried a quiet weight. "He's trying," she said softly. "He just wants you to see him." Michael felt a wave of guilt crash over him, as relentless as the ocean outside. He'd wanted to connect to be the father they needed, but instead he'd pushed Ethan away with a single careless moment. He stood intending to follow his son, but Clara held up a hand. "Give him a minute," she said. "He'll come back when he's ready. Maybe start with Lily." Michael nodded his chest tight and turned to his daughter, who was watching him now with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Lily," he said, his voice softer now, "tell me about your boat. What kind of adventures does it have?" She hesitated, then picked up her sketch pad, her small fingers tracing the lines of the sail. "It's going to find a coral reef," she said, her voice tentative but growing stronger. "One with fish that glow in the dark." Michael listened, really listened, as Lily described her imaginary reef, her words painting a world of color and wonder. For the first time that morning, he felt a spark of connection, fragile but real. But in the back of his mind, Ethan's tearful face lingered, a reminder of the distance he still had to cross. The house, with its gleaming surfaces and endless views, felt less like a home and more like a challenge, one he wasn't sure he knew how to meet. The Monterey sun hung high in the sky, its light scattering diamonds across the Pacific, as Michael Bennett stood on the deck of his seaside estate, the wind tugging at his sweater. It was mid-morning, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of salt and kelp, a reminder of the wild ocean just beyond the cliffs. After the misstep with Ethan in the family room yesterday, Michael had spent a restless night replaying the moment, the ink spilling Ethan's tear-streaked face, the way his own sharp words had cut deeper than he'd intended. He'd wanted to fix it, to chase after his son, and make things right, but Clara's advice to give Ethan space had held him back. Now, with a new day stretching before him, Michael was determined to try again. No emails, no calls, no distractions, just him, Lily, and Ethan, and the chance to be the father he hadn't been in far too long. He'd told his assistant to block his calendar for the day, a decision that had earned a stunned pause on the other end of the line. For once, the empire he'd built could wait. Inside the house was alive with the small sounds of morning. Clara was in the kitchen humming softly as she packed a wicker picnic basket with sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of lemonade. Lily and Ethan were in the family room, their voices drifting through the open sliding doors, a mix of giggles and the occasional squabble over who got to hold the big pair of scissors. Michael peeked in, his heart lifting at the sight of them. Lily was sprawled on the rug, surrounded by sheets of bright construction paper, her fingers sticky with glue, as she pieced together what looked like the beginnings of a kite. Ethan was beside her, clutching a spool of string, his earlier upset seemingly forgotten, as he chattered about how high their kite would fly. Clara had suggested the activity last night after dinner, her eyes twinkling as she proposed a family outing to the beach. "The kids love kites," she'd said, her voice casual but pointed. "And it's something you can all do together." Michael had latched onto the idea, grateful for the lifeline. A kite-building session, followed by a trip to the shore, felt like the perfect way to rebuild what he'd started to break. Michael stepped into the room, keeping his movements slow, not wanting to disrupt the fragile harmony. "Looking good, you two," he said, crouching beside Lily's pile of paper scraps. Her kite was a chaotic blend of red, blue, and yellow, with a lopsided star drawn in marker across the center. "That's gonna soar," he added, hoping his enthusiasm didn't sound forced. Lily glanced up, her hazel eyes cautious but curious. "You think so, Daddy?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I want it to look like a fish, but Ethan says it's too messy." Ethan, still clutching the string, stuck out his tongue. "It's not messy, it's just weird," he said, then ducked as Lily swatted at him with a glue stick. Michael laughed, the sound surprising him, and ruffled Ethan's hair. "Weird's good, buddy. Makes it one of a kind." Ethan grinned a small victory, and Michael felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could do this after all. Clara appeared in the doorway, the picnic basket slung over one arm and a canvas bag filled with kite-making supplies in the other. Ready to take this show to the beach, she asked, her tone bright, but with that familiar undercurrent of gentle authority. The kids scrambled to their feet, Lily clutching her half-finished kite, and Ethan dragging the spool of string behind him like a trophy. Michael grabbed the bag from Clara, his fingers brushing hers for a moment. "Thanks for this," he said quietly, hoping she understood the weight of his gratitude. She nodded, her smile soft but knowing, and led the way out to the deck where a path wound down to the private stretch of beach below the estate. The walk to the shore was short but breathtaking, the path lined with wild grasses that swayed in the breeze. The ocean stretched out before them, a vast canvas of blue and green, its surface broken by the occasional crest of a wave. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the steady rhythm of the surf. Lily skipped ahead, her kite flapping like a flag, while Ethan lagged behind, stopping to pick up a smooth pebble and turn it over in his hands. Michael slowed his pace to match his son's, resisting the urge to hurry him along. "Find something good?" he asked, nodding at the pebble. Ethan held it up, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "It's got a stripe," he said, pointing to a faint white line running through the gray stone. "Like it's got a secret." Michael crouched beside him, taking the pebble and turning it in the sunlight. "You're right," he said. "Maybe it's from a pirate's treasure chest." Ethan's face lit up, and for a moment Michael saw the boy from the storybook scene the night before, full of wonder and possibility. At the beach, Clara spread a blanket on the sand, anchoring it with the picnic basket and a couple of rocks. The kids set to work, finishing their kites, Lily meticulously gluing on more paper to shape her fish, while Ethan's creation was a jumble of green and orange, less a kite than a bundle of enthusiasm. Michael sat cross-legged beside them, helping when asked, but mostly watching, marveling at their focus. Lily's hands moved with precision, her brow furrowed as she adjusted a wooden dowel. "This has to be perfect," she said almost to herself. "Fish don't fly if their fins are crooked." Michael smiled, struck by her determination. "You're going to make a great marine biologist," he said, and this time her smile reached her eyes. "You think I can?" she asked, her voice soft but hopeful. "Absolutely," he said, and meant it. "You've got the ocean in you, Lily." Ethan, meanwhile, was struggling with his kite, the string tangling as he tried to tie it to the frame. Michael reached over, his hands steady as he helped untangle the mess. "You gotta loop it like this," he said, showing Ethan a simple knot. "My dad taught me that when I was your age." Ethan looked up, his brown eyes wide. "Grandpa flew kites?" he asked, as if the idea of Michael's father doing something so ordinary was unthinkable. Michael chuckled, a memory surfacing, his own childhood, a windy day on a different beach, his father's calloused hands guiding his own. "Yeah, he did. We used to make kites out of newspaper and sticks. They weren't fancy, but they flew." Ethan nodded, absorbing the story, and for the first time that day, he didn't pull away when Michael rested a hand on his shoulder. With the kites finished, they moved to an open stretch of sand, the wind stronger now, tugging at their clothes. Clara handed Lily her kite first, showing her how to hold it to catch the breeze. "Run toward the water," she instructed, "and let it go when you feel it pull." Lily took off her sneakers, kicking up sand, her laughter trailing behind her as the kite wobbled, then soared its star-shaped tail, dancing against the sky. Ethan was next, his kite lurching upward in fits and starts. But when it caught the wind, he whooped, his small frame bouncing with excitement. Michael took a turn running with Ethan's kite until it climbed high, the string taut in his hands. For a moment, he was a kid again, the world narrowing to the tug of the kite and the sound of his children's cheers. They spent the afternoon on the beach, the kites dipping and soaring as the sun arced across the sky. Over lunch, peanut butter sandwiches and tart lemonade, Lily opened up about her dreams of studying coral reefs. Her words tumbling out in a rush of passion. "There's this place in Australia," she said, her hands waving where the coral looks like a city underwater. "I want to see it someday." Michael listened, his heart swelling, and asked questions, drawing her out. Ethan, emboldened by the kite's success, shared his pirate story, his voice growing louder as he described a cave filled with glowing shells. But then, almost shyly, he added, "I thought you didn't like my stories, Daddy. You're always busy." The words hit Michael like a wave, cold and unyielding. He set down his sandwich, his throat tight. "I'm never too busy for you, Ethan," he said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "I'm here now, and I want to hear every story you've got." Ethan studied him, his small face serious, then nodded as if sealing a pact. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of kites and laughter, the kids taking turns running along the shore, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Clara watched from the blanket, her presence quiet but steady, like a lighthouse guiding them through uncharted waters. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Michael felt something shift inside him. The distance he'd felt yesterday wasn't gone, but it was smaller, softened by the hours spent listening, laughing, being present. The kites still tethered to the earth, but reaching for the sky felt like a promise, a reminder that connection, however fragile, could still take flight. The evening settled over the Monterey estate like a soft blanket, the sky outside deepening to a rich indigo as the last traces of sunset faded beyond the Pacific. Inside, the living room glowed with the warm flicker of a fire in the stone hearth, its crackling a quiet counterpoint to the distant murmur of waves. Michael Bennett sat on the plush rug, his back against the base of a cream-colored sofa, his legs stretched out in front of him. The room smelled faintly of cedar and cocoa, the latter from mugs of hot chocolate that Clara had prepared for Lily and Ethan, who were nestled under a quilt nearby. The day on the beach had left them sun-kissed and sandy, their eyes bright with the kind of tired contentment that only comes from hours spent outdoors. Michael felt it too, a bone-deep satisfaction that was new and fragile like a seedling pushing through soil. Yesterday's kite flying had cracked open something in him, a door to a version of himself he'd almost forgotten, a father, not just a provider. But tonight, as the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, he knew the real work was just beginning. He wanted to hold on to this feeling to make it last beyond a single day. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, a thick, weathered book open in her lap. It was one of her favorites, she'd said, a collection of coastal folk tales she'd found in a used bookstore in Carmel. Her glasses caught the firelight as she read, her voice steady and melodic, weaving a story about a lighthouse keeper named Elias, who tended a lonely beacon on a storm-battered cliff. Every night, Clara read, Elias climbed the spiral stairs, his lantern swinging to light the lamp that guided ships through the fog. He never saw the sailors he saved, but he knew his light was their hope. Lily, curled up with her stuffed octopus, listened with her chin resting on her hands, her eyes wide. Ethan, sprawled beside her, clutched a cardboard sword he'd made earlier, occasionally waving it, as if fending off imaginary storms. Michael watched them, his heart swelling at their rapt attention. Clara had a gift, he thought, for making stories feel like magic, for turning words into worlds. The room was cozy, intimate, in a way the sprawling estate rarely felt. The furniture, usually pristine and staged like a showroom, was softened by the quilt and the scattering of pillows the kids had dragged from their rooms. A tray on the coffee table held the remnants of their evening empty mugs, a plate with crumbs from Clara's homemade shortbread and a small bowl of sliced apples that Ethan had nibbled at absent-mindedly. Michael glanced at the table, noticing a piece of folded paper tucked under the bowl. Curious, he reached for it, unfolding it carefully. It was a drawing, clearly a joint effort by Lily and Ethan. The paper showed a family of stick figures standing on a beach, the ocean sketched in bold blue strokes behind them. There was a tall figure with a tie, him he realized a smaller one with pigtails for Lily, and a tiny one with a pirate hat for Ethan. A fourth figure with glasses and a scarf stood beside them, Clara. Above them, a kite soared its tail, a rainbow of scribbled lines. Michael's throat tightened. The drawing was simple, almost crude, but it captured something he hadn't dared hope for a family together. Clara's voice drew him back to the story. One night, she continued, a storm unlike any other came so fierce it shook the lighthouse to its bones. Elias climbed the stairs, his hands trembling, knowing that if the light went out, ships would crash against the rocks. Ethan sat up straighter, his sword forgotten. Did he make it? He asked, his voice urgent. Clara smiled, pausing for effect. He did, she said, but not because he was strong or brave. He made it because he believed the light mattered, because he knew someone out there needed it. Lily nodded solemnly as if she understood the weight of the words. Michael felt them too, the idea of a light that guided even when you couldn't see who it helped. He thought of his own life, endless meetings, deals, the pursuit of success that had felt so vital, but had left him adrift far from the people who needed him most. When Clara closed the book, the room fell quiet. The only sounds the pop of the fire and the faint whistle of wind outside. Lily yawned, rubbing her eyes, but Ethan was still wide awake, his mind buzzing. Clara, he said, did Elias ever get lonely, being up there all by himself? Clara set the book down, her expression softening. He did, she said, but he had a trick. He'd write letters to his family, even though they were far away. Not to send just to feel close to them. It reminded him why he kept the light burning. Michael listened, struck by the simplicity of it. He'd spent years building a life for his kids, thinking money and opportunities were enough, but he'd never thought to just be with them, to share in their small moments. He cleared his throat, the sound louder than he intended, in the quiet room. I owe you kids an apology, he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Lily and Ethan turned to him, their faces curious. I've been gone a lot, he continued, and I told myself it was for you to give you everything. But I missed what really matters, being here listening to your stories, seeing your drawings. He held up the paper, his fingers tracing the stick figures. This means more to me than anything I've built out there. Lily crawled over, climbing into his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. We missed you, Daddy, she whispered. Ethan hesitated, then scooted closer, his cardboard sword resting against Michael's knee. Can you stay longer this time? He asked, his voice small but hopeful. Michael nodded, his eyes stinging. I'm going to try, buddy. I promise. He looked at Clara, who was watching with a quiet smile, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Clara, he said, you've been their light when I wasn't here. Thank you. She shook her head, brushing off the praise. They're easy to love, she said simply. Then after a pause, she added, my mom used to say, time is the one thing you can't buy back. I learned that the hard way when I was younger, always chasing something else. But moments like this, she gestured to the kids, the fire, the drawing in Michael's hand. These are what make a family. Her words settled over the room, heavy with truth. Michael thought of his own parents, of the long hours his father had worked, The way his mother had filled their home with small rituals, bedtime stories, Sunday pancakes, walks in the park that had held them together. He'd let those things slip away, caught up in a world that demanded everything, but gave little in return. But tonight, sitting here with his children, he saw it clearly. Family wasn't the house, the wealth, or the name he'd made. It was this, the warmth of Lily's hug, the weight of Ethan's trust, the quiet wisdom of Clara's stories. It was the light they created together, fragile but enduring. As the fire burned low, Lily and Ethan began to doze, their heads resting against Michael. He carried them upstairs one at a time, tucking them into bed with a gentleness he hadn't known he still had. Back in the living room, Clara was tidying up, stacking the mugs on the tray. "You did good today," she said, her voice low. "They'll remember it." Michael nodded, the drawing still in his hand. "I want them to remember more than just today," he said. "I want to be here, really be here." Clara smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Then you will," she said, "one moment at a time." Michael stood by the window looking out at the dark ocean, the lighthouse in the distance blinking steadily. The lesson was simple, but profound. A family isn't built on grand gestures or material wealth, but on the time and love you give, the moments you share when no one else is watching. For parents, it's a reminder to prioritize presence over presence, to listen to the dreams and fears of their children, to be the light that guides them through life's storms. As Michael folded the drawing and slipped it into his pocket, he made a silent vow to carry that light, to make every day a step toward the home he'd always wanted, but had only now begun to understand.